Let's talk about ELYON. So, for those of you that have followed the channel for a little while, I did some coverage of the first ELYON CBT, and I had planned to cover a bit more in the recent second closed beta. Unfortunately, I forgot to hit the record button for a lot of the beta, so instead I'm going to give my general first impressions of the game and just talk about how the game feels. And I'm going to be using a mix of footage from the first CBT and the current one as well, because I do have some footage, just not as much as I'd have liked to have. Of course, it is a closed beta, and things could be subject to change, but I'm doubtful we'll see any major before September, so let's just get right into it. Now then, let's begin. As it stands in the beta, there was the option for 2 servers. Whether there'll be more in the full game, we'll have to see, as they were throwing out beta keys to practically everyone. Yet, despite this, the servers felt fairly stable. I saw a good amount of people. We'll just have to see how it is on launch. Now, once you choose one of these 2 servers, you're then given the choice between the 2 factions in the game, the Honourable Vulpin or the Evil Scum Rebel Ontari. Yes, I picked Vulpin. Now, this does mean when you select a faction for a specific server, you're locked into that faction. All characters made on that server will be that faction, and if you want to play the other faction, you have to pick another server. Now, I'm not quite sure how to feel about this. This does mean if there's a dominant faction on a server, there's no real easy way to balance it out. And if we're going to end up with 2 servers, I can potentially see factions just choosing opposite servers to dominate, because at the end of the day, no one wants to be on the losing side. Hopefully, we'll end up with more servers on launch, but I feel like there'll need to be a way to incentivize players to choose weaker factions. And even then, it's hard to do that from the server screen. I don't know. This is just a weird thing that I don't know how to feel about. Anyway, once you've selected your server, you're then able to create your character, and you're presented with the different races: the human, elf, Ein, and the orc. Your standard races, and then the Ein. That's for those of you that want to play small, fairy creatures. It's not my cup of tea, but if you want to do it, you can. Character creation overall is okay. It's not as in-depth as something like BDO, but it's good enough with varying options for races. My only issue was the lack of good beards for the elves. Wasn't a fan. The Ein are interesting in that you can select one of several fairy creatures. You don't have to just be a small cat. You can be a bunny, a raccoon, a cat, or an otter as well, I think. There's a variety of things that I'll never play, but I'm sure some of you out there are all about it. You then also had the 6 classes available, the Warlord being your big tanky melee, the Elementalist being your mage, your Mystic being your healing druid type, the Assassin being your rogue, and the Gunner is your ranged DPS, and the new class in this beta was the Slayer, which lets you smack people about with a massive greatsword, so of course, I had to play this class this time around. Once you've created your character, you're then given a nice little animated cutscene to open the story for you. And much like every other MMO, people need saving, and you're the only hope they have left. Then you're dropped right into the tutorial. Regardless of faction, you start in the same place aboard the Inventus, which is under attack from an endless swarm of enemies. We get a nice shot panning down to our weird cocoon, which our character is then promptly freed from. The cocoon is never really explained, but hey. The game then starts to teach you the basics like how to dodge and break out of CC by immediately killing the person that freed you. You're then given a few enemies to deal with, a brief ladder climb, you'll then let more people die and proceed on for a portal to kill more enemies, and eventually, a few more quests later, you get to sit on a big cannon and shoot enemies for a few seconds before a boss immediately destroys the cannon. Once you kill that boss, the tutorial is complete, and then you're spat out into a different part of the world, depending on your faction. And by this point, you're pretty much level 20, despite really doing nothing at all, which isn't really an issue, but I mean, what's wrong with starting out at level 1, you know? I don't know, it's just a small nitpick. Speaking of levels, I'm not 100% sure if there's a hard cap in the game. I've heard people say the soft cap is 44, and leveling does get a lot slower around level 40, but I've also seen content in the game marked as high as level 50, so that's where I'd say the cap is at. But as with most Korean MMOs, gear is a lot more important than your actual level, though you can sort of breeze through the first 10 levels without thinking about gear. This of course is also an action combat MMO. Now, I've not personally been able to really get into a lot of action combat MMOs. It might just be because I'm so used to your traditional tab targeting, but it's something I want to get into because it feels good. Your skills feel fun to use. I think one of my worries with games like this is always ping when it comes down to it. Though I didn't PvP a ton, so I never properly got a feel for if it felt off. But ELYON, for the most part, feels good. One issue I did have was it sometimes just felt like my sword was missing. Now, there is an accuracy stat in the game, and the higher level the zone, the higher the accuracy stat that's recommended, so that's probably why it felt like I was swinging and missing sometimes. And while I don't mind stats like this in a normal MMO, it feels wrong in an action MMO. It's hard to explain, it just feels like a bug. Like I have this giant sword and I'm slicing right through the enemy, but I get no feedback every now and then. It's a small nitpick, but it's one thing that just never felt right. But anyway, let's get back into my questing experience. Starting from where you're first spat out into the world, you're introduced to the faction main characters. Then you're given a glider and told to glide to the nearby camp, and it teaches you to rocket jump into the air, which you can do every 30 seconds to get into a gliding position. You're also then able to boost yourself into the air again if you hit the button at the right time. You have an icon on the side, a little feather that bounces up and down, and as long as you get it right in the middle, it'll boost you up. Depending on the glider, you can do this multiple times per flight. The game does seem to have an obsession with these skill checks, and while it's cool for speeding up stuff like gathering and mining, it feels a little unnecessary for the gliding. But anyway, once you've landed in the nearby camp, you're then taught about abilities and how they work, so as you level, you'll gain attribute points which can be specced into different skills, and each skill has several variations, each one costing a fair amount more depending on the grade of the skill. Some of these skills also need to be unlocked by acquiring the tomes or skill books to learn them, which I think is really cool. It gives a lot of variation and a bit more depth. It also means I have a lot more to actually read over when the game comes out. But for those of you that don't want to bother reading through all the skills, there are PvE and PvP default templates saved, so you can just use them as soon as you've unlocked the required skills. You can also save your own builds as well, which is very nice. More games need features like that. After you've been taught about skills, you're then sent off to kill mobs along the road to the next small outpost. You also get given a hoverboard for travel along the way, which is pretty much a mount, so no time is wasted. There are other mounts that can be purchased at a stronghold later on, which are faster, as well as some on the Ruby store, which is something I'll get to later. Anyway, once arriving at the next town, you're then taught about runes, which are gems you slot into your equipment of various colours. These can be leveled up using a resource called rune powder, and you can freely swap them in and out of your gear. Depending on the colour rune you have socketed, you get 1 point put towards a set of passives that will do a variety of things, so you can choose what you spec into. Of course, the runes level also contributes to your gear score on top of that. But once you're done learning about runes, you're then introduced to the quest boards, which give you about 10 quests to do in the area. And to continue the main story, you have to be a level higher, which, conveniently, those quests help you do. Once you're done, you head over to the next outpost to do a main story quest that involves you taking over the outpost in a Far Cry-style manner, and then you rinse and repeat the process. This continues up until you get to the first stronghold. Once you're in this zone, for some reason you then have to do all the quests on the board one by one, instead all at once like in earlier zones. And then once you're done, you can repeat these quests as dailies. One issue I did have with the main story quest was it's heavily phased, like every quest area is phased, and when you get there, everything despawns around you, and it is very jarring and immersion breaking. You also can't do these quests with a party of friends, so I remember trying to level up with a friend in the first beta, and we just couldn't progress the main story together, so we had to do it separately. So one would be waiting for the other one at the end, which was a bit of an annoyance, but apart from that, it was just standard quest and experience, really. I should note that they also introduce you to some really cool minigame type quests along the way. I really do hope there's a wide variety of them, because I think having random event type minigames really breaks up the monotony of grinding away. You have minigames like the ones where you have to stealth around and steal a dragon's treasure while avoiding detection from mobs, one where you just have to collect a certain amount of chests while dodging bubbles that trap you, and one that's just a gauntlet of traps with coins and chests that you have to run down. There's even ones for when you're foraging where you have to glide around and collect stuff in the air, while collecting chests and mining veins along the way. There are also some of these quests out in the open world that are like trying to get all the colours of the cat to match, and memory games where you have to memorise the path and follow it. Then on top of this, you also have world quests that you can join every now and then, which can consist of a boss you have to fight or a simple fishing contest. I think distractions like this are really what help the game, and kinda remind me of stuff like RuneScape and the random events in that game. Now, there are actually also airships in ELYON, which I believe you unlock around level 37, 36, somewhere around there. You're able to rent airships at these big towers and strongholds, and then you can fly around on these and you can kill mobs and do dailies up in the sky, which is really cool. The one thing is, a lot of the mobs up in the sky you need to be with a party to kill. It kind of reminds me of Final Fantasy games where you'll be on an airship, you have this hook, like grappling hook thing that you pull mobs onto with, or like a harpoon that you'll pull the mob onto the airship with, and then you have to fight in a party to kill the mob. So I don't know if Final Fantasy XIV has anything like that. I've recently started playing a little bit of that, but it wouldn't surprise me if it did, because it's a very Final Fantasy type thing. But yeah, I never got involved in any PvP in the air, though I'd be curious to see how that would go, because I think that has potential to be really cool. Though, I'd like to be able to own my own airship as well. So I don't know if that'll be a thing. Maybe I just never got to it, but that is something else that I really want to look more into. But let's get back to talking about the dailies. Now, this is where things get a little weird, as to do dailies you need quest letters, and you get 20 of these a day, but most daily quests require 2 quest letters, so you can only really do 10 dailies a day. The game ends up capping a lot of content like this, such as dungeons. You can get up to 4 dungeon rewards per day, and you get an hour in the Dragon Garden, which means if you're just trying to level, you're probably going to end up having to kill mobs over and over, which is actually also a nice way of getting epic pieces to drop, though in the beta we were given a lot of loot drop rate potions, which probably helped. Speaking of dungeons, I did find myself enjoying the boss fights in there. There are a lot of solo dungeons in the game, and then there are timed variations of these dungeons for higher gear score players. Some of these dungeons can be entered by opening up the world map and selecting a dungeon, and then some other dungeons you had to physically enter. I will say though, the problem I did have with the dungeons were they were really simple in design, usually just feeling like a corridor that it sends you down, or an arena that you have to find mobs in, and if you don't kill the mobs in a certain area, you can't progress, as there's just a big X that tells you can't go any further. And again, I'm not usually one for caring too much about my immersion, but the big X and invisible walls telling you can't progress unless you kill a certain amount of mobs in the room, or all the mobs in the room, is, I don't know, it's a little off-putting, but it does make up for it with the boss fights being a bit more interesting. There are also dungeons that can be done in a party, and they seem to have been bumped up to higher levels and higher gear scores for this beta. And I don't know if it was just because of the amount of people, or if it was an issue with the system itself, but these dungeons were really hard to get a party for in the beta, so I'm going to end up having to try these out more on launch. There was also the dimensional portals, which were only open at certain times in the day, and you could only spend, I think, 7 hours a week before you were locked out. These were a good way of getting more Mana Awakening XP, another system that's introduced not too late, but a little later on, which is like another set of talents that you can have to spend mana on to learn. You get mana from various things like the main story, Luminous Battles, and dimensional portals. The skill trees are all intertwined in this, so you can start in one and finish in the opposite if you choose to do so. On top of doing all this, you then also have PvP arenas, open world PvP, clan wars, and realm wars. Clans being guilds you can have 10v10 battles with, and the realm wars being these big 150v150 faction wars. I never really got to take part in the faction war, and because I mostly played by myself, very sad I know, I didn't really get to participate in a clan. Though I did do a bit of the open world PvP, and it was fun for the most part. You do have the issue of if people have higher gear score, they will just wipe you away. And you also end up earning honor through PvP as well, and there's PvP specific gear that you can get which will make you more effective in PvP, so that on top also helps. Next, I probably should talk about the gearing and all the systems that are involved in that. I think a lot of people struggle to understand how the gearing worked, mostly because it's not super well explained and it's kind of poorly paced. You kind of just get thrown infographics for the different systems at random points throughout the main story. So, to break down what I understood, each piece of gear has a certain amount of upgrade attempts. Some pieces of gear also have gold attempts, which increase your chance of success. So yes, there's RNG involved. Pretty much you use a weapon or armor stone to upgrade your gear by +1, +2, +3. You can craft up to the higher tier upgrade stones if you have enough of the lesser ones, but each time you make an attempt with a stone, whether it succeeds or fails, you lock one attempt at upgrading the gear. So if you have 5 attempts and fail the first one, then you have 4 attempts to upgrade. You can of course reset this using a scroll, though I'm not sure how easy these will be to acquire in the full game. After you're done upgrading, if you manage to get a blue piece to +6, you can then use another NPC to upgrade that to an epic piece of gear, and then you have to get a certain amount of plus, and then you can upgrade it again. Then for pieces of gear that you don't need, you have the Reforging system, which is another NPC you can use that will take 3 pieces of gear of similar quality and give you a prediction of what it could turn into. Then if you choose to do so, it'll randomly select one of the predictions and spit that back out to you. These pieces of gear will already have a plus, and all the upgrade attempts will already be locked to begin with. I never spent too long playing around with this, but it wasn't a bad way to deal with gear that you didn't need. Other than that, there was also Enchanting, which was another NPC that would give you random stats on your gear. I do think the pacing for introducing some of these systems just isn't the best, with the explanations given, so people ended up feeling a bit unsure of what gear they should even be upgrading. Though from what I figured out much later on, it seemed like the best gear seemed to drop from various world bosses that would spawn throughout the world, much like in BDO. You can also craft your own weapons and armor from your home, but that requires a lot of effort, and I'd have to play the full game before I know if crafting is a viable way to go. Speaking of houses, there's quite a bit to talk about there, though not much has changed since the previous beta, so a lot of what I've said in my old video on housing still applies. You can teleport to your house at the click of a button once you've unlocked it, and it'll take you to this instanced island with your house and workshop beside it. You can also visit other people's homes if you wish to do so. There's also luxury housing, which is owning a house out in the open world, and these require you to pay taxes in the form of in-game gold. And while I usually like the idea of having open world housing, something about it in ELYON just didn't connect with me. It kind of felt like the housing areas were just sort of thrown in. It may just be that they were empty at the moment, so I never really got a feel for it. But it could also be that you don't get the customization you can get in other games. You can't really move the workshop or the house around, and there weren't a ton of furniture options from what I played. You can change what it looks like a little bit, but I didn't get to make any drastic changes, though perhaps you can do a lot more the more you level up your house. The more you do this, the more seeds, saplings, and ores you can plant to collect more resources. You also have a warehouse that you can level up in the house to get more space, as well as an altar that can be set to give you different buffs. I do want to get more used to the housing and give it a proper try, but a lot of the systems feel very mobile game-esque, with you having to upgrade your house and it taking a certain amount of time to finish, and if you have a certain item you can complete it instantly, alongside the Luminous Battles, which is kind of just an auto-battler that'll farm certain items for you while you AFK. The Luminous being these passive pet constellations that sort of give you a buff, but can also be used in these battles. There's like a cap of 4 hours of energy to use in the auto-battler, or if you pay for the premium star blessing buff in the Ruby store, you get 8 hours on top, which is the perfect amount to leave it running while you sleep. I suppose some people might think it's cool that you can farm stuff while AFK, but I don't particularly like the system. It kind of just feels like a waste of electric. But if you want to be as efficient as possible and you have a normal sleeping schedule, having the premium star blessing and leaving this on each night while you sleep is going to give you an edge. I think it's in stuff like this and some of the stuff on the Ruby store that I have issues with. I was going to do a separate video just going through the Ruby store, though I think I'll save that for when the game launches so we can get an idea of what will be in the final version. The things I took the most issue with were just the resurrection scrolls that you can get to instantly come back, as well as the premium star blessing buff. But again, I will go over that when the game finally launches. Overall, I enjoyed my time with ELYON. I'll certainly play it on launch and show off more when I can, though I don't know how much time I'll end up investing in ELYON. It doesn't feel like it'll be the next MMO for me, but my hope is it'll at least be fun for a month or so, and hey, then I'll have gotten my money's worth. So that is it for this video. It's something a little different, doing a whole breakdown of my impressions of ELYON. I didn't quite get everything in there, I don't imagine, but I will be putting out more on ELYON when the game actually releases. So thanks for watching, make sure to like, comment, subscribe, all the usual YouTube stuff. Feel free to check me out on Twitch or join our Discord, and I will see you all in the next video.